Deep under the sea, oh wait, wrong story. Deep under the ocean, following the events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a man named Andrew Ryan would start viewing the government with more and more disdain. At first, it was the acquisition of his property and finances, which then he would proceed to burn the property down, and I mean, when it came to his finances, he still had to pay taxes like the rest of us. But he would start regarding the state as a parasite. But after witnessing the young men who were sent to war to fight for the country, with many of them meeting their own demise, Andrew Ryan was, for all intents and purposes, done with society. Having become completely disgusted with how the state wielded power, he and his steam liner would sail out into the ocean in an attempt to start a new city somewhere in the world. However, meeting much of the same issue and becoming disillusioned with it, he would ultimately choose a place where he says it was not impossible to build, it was impossible to build anywhere else. Deep within the ocean, on the sea floor, away from the influence of government, Rapture would be built, and for a time, it was good. Many breakthroughs would be made in the name of science. Ryan would recruit the best and brightest to come to his city to conduct their work free of the hindrance of government. This led to some pretty horrendous violations of human rights, but arguably none were more heinous than the creation of the Big Daddies and Little Sisters. So in today's episode, we'll be focusing on specifically the Big Daddies, since we more or less covered the Little Sisters, and discuss their internal anatomy within their suits, how they came to be, and ultimately what happens should they lose their little sister. As the building in the city was in its infancy, divers were sent deep within the frigid dark waters to begin drilling into the rocks to create the foundation of Rapture. As this process continued and buildings were constructed and scientists brought in, they would all begin their work. Eventually, Adam would be discovered along with plasmids. As time went on, everyone would start imbibing these DNA-altering materials, which would cause many to begin having ideas concerning the divers. The divers were still very much so important in Rapture, as you might imagine.
Stop it!
As the city profited from science and discovery, it would continue to grow and bring in more people. As more people were brought in, not everyone would succeed for their original purpose that they came down there, and because of this, some were suited up in a diver suit and then sent out to drill more rocks and create more foundations for future buildings to be constructed. But likely mishaps would occur, as they do, as the human body is rather frail with all that pressure being applied to it, plus contending with the super cold temperatures of the water meant that heat loss was an ever-present issue. The reality is, a human in its natural form would be subjected to constant working environments that the bodies were never really meant to deal with. And this sparked an idea. Why not change the human to become more than what nature just designed it to be, thus making it a better worker? The lines of thinking at this point became to change the human anatomy and physiology to become more resilient in the face of hostile working environments located just outside the walls of Rapture, because this was an ongoing, ever-needed process. Rivets would snap, walls would begin caving in after pressure was applied to them for such a long time, and this would cause water to leak within the structure. The concept of the Big Daddy came into view with Dr. Sushong being the creator of these monsters and subsequently his own demise. Taking the human diver and altering them with Adam would ensure not only that their bodies could withstand the pressures and temperatures of the ocean, but that they would be forever mindless and devoid of their own free will. By attaching their skin and organs to the interior of the suit would become their body, making them more capable within it. With the suit came life support functions like oxygen rebreathers. The durability of the suit itself gave the Big Daddies a form of exoskeleton that probably resembled Kevlar, and a giant metal helmet would protect vital areas, acting as like a second skull and rib cage for any internal organs and the brain. This allowed for Big Daddies to move about as they pleased without the protection of the building walls, which ultimately allowed them to maintain the city for extended periods of time without the need to come back and rest and eat or warm up.
Stop it!
They could pretty much indefinitely stay outside and continue working on repairing anything that may be broken in the city. And for a time, this was good, but we all know what happens to Rapture. To get a good idea about the future of the Big Daddies and why they were pair bonded with Little Sisters, we must first talk about the strengths brought on by the atom, which would practically mutilate their form and turn them into grotesque beasts just below the surface of Kevlar and metal. So getting a good look at them, you might be inclined to believe that it's just a regular person in there with just increased strength. A good comparison, as most people would probably view these things, is sort of like the brute splicer created 10 years later during the events of Bioshock 2, but this is not actually really the case. Below the surface of the suit, the important thing to note is that this actually is their body. The suit is quite literally intermeshed with their skin, and because of that, the skin stretches out to all corners of the suit to meet up with the material and metal and intertwine with it. This misconception that Big Daddies are just people wearing suits is way off. Well, at least, concerning the later iterations. The first iterations were just people. So it's much more morbidly fascinating than that. The larger than normal body, the hunched over appearance, and the actual size of the helmet itself means that the body itself is in fact shaped to that size too.
Dear God. There's more. No.
The issue is, to have someone become this has changed their physical appearance drastically as well as their skeletal structuring. So, you know where we have to start, and man, with all these movies I've been covering, it's been a hot minute, hasn't it? But starting with the feet, we see how large these bad boys actually are. This means that just on the other side of that metal is, well, the skin, which is also intermeshed with it. This would mean that the tarsal bones would have to lengthen quite a bit to grow to the size that the metal suggests that they are. The ligaments as well would also be lengthened, along with just about everything else to fill the size of its container. Moving up the legs, we get to the tibula and fibular bones, which compose the lower leg. Within this area, considering how large they are and taller somewhat than normal splicers in humans, the bones have grown as well. Plus, the calf muscle, as we can already tell, has had muscle growth, and this will typically be the theme that we see throughout the Big Daddy, as this would allow for their ability to withstand things like currents in the ocean by allowing them to stabilize themselves on the ground better, but also to support its own weight. Moving up to the knees, they would still operate like the original knee would, but they would need to be greatly strengthened to deal with the extra weight now put on them by the simple fact that the suit is likely hundreds of pounds on its own, and now the original body mass has increased.
Damn, boy, he's thick!
What's interesting is, as we move up to the thigh region, we can see that the calves and thighs are roughly about the same size as each other. Heading towards the abdomen is where things begin to get a little muddled and more difficult to imagine, but I will try to do my best to explain the anatomical changes underneath the suit because they're fairly grisly, which is also, pretty fun to talk about. We see the metal portion of the suit beginning in this area, and this would mean that the abdomen has distended in this metal chamber. So remember that the skin is now intermeshed with the metal, meaning that the organs are just behind this metal plate. Likely, there would be some organ changes, which we will get to the real internals in a moment. Moving further up to the torso area, you might notice this is where the head is, but it's basically center mass. Due to the process of gene manipulation, it appears that there are two possibilities. Either the head has moved down by spinal changes around the thoracic and cervical area of the spine, and muscle has built up, or the skin and skull are stretched out and simply take this shape. I believe it to be the former over the latter, seeing as the muscle increase dictates that likely the trapezius muscles are also larger. Speaking of, the shoulders are now absolutely massive in order to deal with the extra pressures of walking around with this suit, but also the enhanced strength of the Big Daddy has for, its original purpose, which would be to move heavy pieces of metal and break through rock in order to maintain Rapture, but also begin constructing new areas for buildings to exist in. Moving further down the arms, we see that they are roughly about the size of the legs, which hints at the strength of them, but also the fact that they have a giant drill on the arm in certain variants means that they didn't really use heavy equipment in order to complete tasks, but were the heavy equipment deployed for construction purposes. Internally, past the structuring of the body, many different things were taking place within it to support this meat mech of that size. However, it should be noted that not all Big Daddies are built the same. Some are quite literally just built different, and this is because as the project went along, new variants were made for their purpose shifted to kind of fill other needs for those that created these monsters, which we'll go over here shortly. Back to their internals, starting with their skeleton, we have seen that they are taller and larger than most splicers, meaning that likely their skeletal system would have to change to keep up with demand. During their creation, the Atom had a direct hand in reactivating the growth plates or epiphyseal plates of the long bones between the middle of the bone itself and at the very ends of the bones. Typically, these will calcify after adulthood or, after puberty really, but with the ability to quite literally manipulate genes and create stem cells as postulated in my Atom video, this would reactivate this area, causing the legs to stretch and also causing the arms to stretch as well, because that's where the long bones are located. This would give them the ability to grow taller, but this would not be enough. As the bones lengthen, they tend to lose density, and as they are stretched, this could cause them to break fairly easily, and considering they have a lot more pressure on them, longer bones without any structural support would not be great. So things like osteoblasts would be sent in to help strengthen the bone. And this would be important again because, you've also got all that muscle strength kind of pulling on everything, and, having as much muscle strength as you like, if you're walking around in a suit weighing hundreds of pounds, contending with the crushing pressure of the ocean, if your bones were like, your and I's bones, they would be pulverized fairly quickly. Not to mention, muscle uses bone as an attachment point, and considering the strength the Big Daddy needs on a daily basis when constructing materials, this would easily snap bone if it wasn't actually enhanced. As the osteoblasts were likely switched on during this time by the Atom, they would make bones quite strong, but along with that, it would also change how the bones were shaped, because not all bones need to actually keep growing, and this rampant regrowth would have some issues. In areas like, the arms, not much would be seen, but in more intricate areas, say like the spine, this bone growth may be why we see them hunched over, as the entire shape of the spine would be compromised as vertebra pressed on other vertebra in strange manners. The osteoblasts would ensure that the skull essentially pressed outwards to meet the metal, or it wouldn't ensure that, but once it started doing that, the bone would be kind of connecting in varying pieces to the skull and then growing from there, which means that the entire head is actually the shape of the head piece, which that must have been really painful. Talk about a splitting headache. Essentially, the human skeleton is really no longer present in its original form with Big Daddies. Instead, it has become more like a gorilla in the sense of thicker bones, forward-leaning posture, but still somewhat human with the longer legs, but also with the bipedal ability that we have right now. Now, thicker bones are pretty awesome. I always love talking about double bone density because it's pretty fascinating, but just for your information, basically right now, you might be sitting here watching this and you could have double bone density. It's essentially this phenomenon where, without any actual detriment to your body, apart from you being less buoyant and having to work harder to swim, you actually have more bone growth on your bones than normal, which makes them stronger. My personal thinking is it kind of seems to stem from Neanderthals, who had much thicker bones than Homo sapiens, but I suspect that actually I might have this, as there are quite a few times where I should have broken a bone and didn't. Anyhow, it's just a cool thing to talk about. Apart from that, the thicker bones being awesome, without strength, is there really any point to them? And that's why you go to the gym and get swole. But with Big Daddies, the entire muscular system has been overhauled, taking into account the actual size of a Big Daddy to support the new body size, and ironically, the new muscle growth that it would need. More muscle would be needed. Typically, humans operate with a certain range of muscle growth, with new fibers being created from satellite cells actually producing new muscle fibers. But there is a limit to this, because usually your body would rather sort of regenerate what was already there and repair the muscle cells. So this is why we don't get like ridiculously huge and just turn into like a blob of muscle because we lift. We still have the same basic muscular structure and same basic shape. With the Big Daddies, this is clearly different. To make up for the new area to be housed in the skin that is now pulled outwards, the muscle presumably began growing to ridiculous proportions in these areas. Again, because the stem cells created in the same manner as when the dock worker's hand was healed after being bitten by a slug-containing atom, so too would these muscle cells begin forming and attaching to the muscle that is already located in the body. This in turn would make them much more powerful. This hypertrophy would almost be like that of a Spartan's, ironically. However, they would kind of be much more misshapen and may pull in different directions and ways, which in turn actually could potentially make them stronger. This strength was obviously quite important for their environment, but when used against humans or splicers, they could literally tear a person apart. And with a drill arm, well, that just isn't great for anyone's insides should that be used. This hypertrophy is interesting in a lot of ways, as stated previously, because what we have is quite literally the addition of new muscle, which we have seen in others who have been affected by atom and plasmids, but strangely, their transformation took a much longer period of time. With the brutes we see in Bioshock 2, what they did was actually take a muscle building plasmid. Now, in the first game, we didn't see any muscle building plasmids, but their muscle mass increased, which could be comparable to the Big Daddies' Sans the Suit. But muscle and bone growth are also pretty awesome. But without the nutrition to support this change, then the body would slowly eat itself over time, not to mention the oxygen saturation levels would need to be high, which is perfect for what we see concerning torso size. The digestive tract likely is longer now to fill the abdomen area of the suit, which, if the small intestine is lengthened, food taken in has more time to get more nutrients extracted from it in order to give the body more components that it needs. Concerning the torso, the lungs would either likely be increased in size with many more alveolar sacs to facilitate the exchange of CO2 and O2 in order to keep the muscles saturated. But there is either another component that helps with this or completely negates the need for lungs at all. Because the suit itself acts as life support, likely there is a tap-in point where the tubes are directly either in the lungs providing oxygen, or it could tap into the very bloodlines of the Big Daddy in order to give them the oxygen they need. This could potentially, as I said, negate the need for anything like lung expansion, but quite literally, they are feeding the grotesque former human oxygen intravenously. Now again, one of the things that should be noted is, as this process entered its later stages, this is where it became more sinister. The first iterations of Big Daddies were simply altered humans. This process was obtained by simply altering their actual genetic coding, much like anybody did with plasmids. Upon doing so, the human form would continue to grow, but there were still small issues of, the human having free will. That old song and dance. So they were, however, still greenlit, as it was a maintenance type of deal, and then placed in a suit to be the alpha variants. They were able to remove the suits, but were definitely still altered in order to complete their jobs, and this is why in Bioshock 2, when Dr. Lamb tells you to remove your helmets, you could still remove your helmet because it's not attached to your face and basically just be removing your head. Eventually though, as Adam became a more and more lucrative business and really really the denizens of Rapture were on the cusp of a civil dispute, they would ultimately have the Big Daddies change from caretakers of Rapture to protectors of Little Sisters. The first one to be successful was Delta, who was a part of the Alpha iteration. They were bonded to a Little Sister above all else, but the issue was just one Little Sister in particular. If they lost that Little Sister, they would either go into a comatose state and then meet their end, or enter a manic rage and destroy everything around them. This would imply that the frontal lobes of the Big Daddies were severely affected during the gene alteration process, and should they lose the Little Sister, this would also kind of indicate that the amygdala may be larger than normal. So likely the brain as a whole, though, was transformed, but the frontal lobe responsible for reasoning and logic was really thought to be either destroyed or suppressed in some way, making these creatures essentially mindless but directable. And this is why it was such a shock that Delta had free will and a functional plan whenever he engaged with anybody who was actually important, because really all the splicers you meet, you just totally annihilate them. The later iterations of the variants of Big Daddies would have a much more aggressive process take place concerning their physical form. They were basically submerged in yellow liquid, which would restructure their body. They would take the shape of their suits, and their brains would be severely hindered. Their vocal cords would be destroyed, and they would receive a pheromone treatment that would cause the Little Sisters to come to them. On top of all this, they were able to pair with multiple Little Sisters so that if one was lost, they would not enter a comatose or manic rage state. Instead, they would simply move on to the next to begin the collection process once more. As the city entered battle with itself, ultimately a large portion of the Big Daddies, even with their superior strength and size, would be destroyed by the citizens who were hopped up on plasmids of their own. On top of this, as the Little Sisters were saved from the atom or harvested if you're a turbo douche, a lot of those bonds would really be broken, and then those Big Daddies would enter altered states. Ultimately, the Big Daddies are creatures whose mere existence is a human rights violation. Having come from likely unwilling participants sent to Fontaine and Rhine to be experimented on by Dr. Sushang, their bodies would be twisted, their humanity taken from them by destruction of the frontal lobe, but this would also result in a creature that could take on most, if not all, challenges presented in front of them, because even after 10 years of the city's partial destruction, there's still Big Daddies wandering around, collecting new Little Sisters and continuing their protection role, despite them likely never really wanting to enter that role in the first place.